Hello and welcome to the Note to File podcast, a collection of interviews, best practices, and candid commentary for clinical research sites. I'm your host, Brad Hightower, founder of Hightower Clinical, a clinical trial site network providing consulting services and end-to-end personalized research infrastructure to physicians with no upfront costs. You can learn more at hightowerclinical.com. If you're enjoying the Note to File podcast, we encourage you to rate, review, and subscribe to the show so we can continue to provide quality content to a larger audience. All show notes, episode transcripts, and contact information can be found at notetofilepodcast.com. All right, guys, as always, thanks so much for tuning in. We're doing something a little bit different with this episode, and rather than doing a one-off interview as sort of a share your story episode, I decided to bring multiple members of the research community together and really start to break down one topic. So this is going to be first in an ongoing series regarding patient recruitment. So this episode, we have Christine Narro, who comes on and discusses not just the importance of recruitment, but some tips and tricks for sites to help keep enrollment going. Ashley Hurd, who helps discuss some tips to help increase subject diversity across recruitment campaigns. And lastly, Dr. Christopher Gantz, who gives us some real great tips on developing some centralized recruitment programs. Without further ado, here is Christine Narro. All right, Christine, thank you for coming on.
Thanks, Brad, for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so just to start, tell me a little bit about the importance of subject recruitment and what sort of downstream effects it may have for a study.
So I think recruitment is really important when it comes to having these trials because we're all on the same team. So we have to remember that we're helping the sponsor or the CRO as the site to enroll and meet recruitment timelines to advance medicine. And that's just part of our purpose in clinical research. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about was feasibility. So when you're a site and you're completing feasibility, it's really important to provide the best guess that you could provide. You don't want to overdo it, but you don't want to underdo it because these sponsors are trying to figure out how many sites they're going to need to hit certain numbers and how long it's going to take to have these studies go on.
Yeah, it's always better to underpromise and overdeliver if you're a site, right?
Yes, 100%. And then another tip that I wanted to give was that if you're at the site, I know that sometimes you get busy with day-to-day activities and other stuff that's going on, maybe an adverse event and stuff like that. So it's really important to just make sure you're reviewing the newsletters that the sponsors or CROs put out, because a lot of times they have information about their timelines and enrollment. And so you can easily see if they share with you where you match up against other sites or how close they are to hitting timelines, not only the end of the study, but also the interim analysis or when they do a data freeze. And it's just really important. I know we're not really talking about queries or data, but to stay on top of that as well. And that just kind of helps speed along their timelines along with recruitment.
Yeah, that's a great point. I even think from a site level, it can be very motivating to see how the other sites are doing. I know that for better or worse, sometimes I can lean into the competitive nature of my PIs to say, hey, these guys over here are out enrolling us. A lot of these guys know each other across the country. So sometimes, it may be a little silly, but it can motivate your physician to increase enrollment, help with recruitment as much as possible. And I also think if you really want to get crazy at a site level, you can see the sites that are succeeding and reach out to say, hey, what are some strategies that are working for you? What can we learn and bring to our site that might increase our enrollment as well? So it's a really good tip to not just, look at, print your newsletter and shove it in a binder, but actually look it over and see what kind of information you can glean from it.
Yes, 100%. And I find it interesting that you said to reach out to other sites. In your specialties, are you able to identify who the other sites are? Or do you know who they are?
Yeah, and again, that may vary. Sometimes the newsletters are as specific as telling you who the PI is at the site. And in that case, you may be able to whittle it down and find out via LinkedIn. Sometimes the coordinators' names are in there. Sometimes they're copied on the email. So again, I think that's probably not very utilized if I had to guess. And I can only think of a couple of rare instances where I've done that. But if you're motivated and can figure it out. I think that's a good strategy that's probably underutilized.
Yeah, I would totally support that because you don't know what you don't know, right? So sometimes they may be having the same struggles that you are. And I don't think that it's the culture that we have right now in research, but I think transparency is always a really good tool. So the more that you're informed, the better you're able to perform. So that's a great tip.
Yeah. And again, that may be, like you say, some of that may be sort of blinded by the sponsor. So it may be difficult for you to figure out who those people are. But I mean, even in that case, talk to your CRA. A lot of times they know, or it may even be one of their sites that they're willing to help, share some strategies with. I understand, when we have these coordinator calls or investigator meetings, sometimes it can be, boring and, not the most exciting topics that get covered. But I mean, that's an opportunity right there that has a direct effect on your site and the success of the study. Is figure out what the people who are successful are doing and see if it's something that applies to you as well. So that's a great tip. Definitely check out the newsletter and pay attention to it.
Absolutely. Another thing I think that's important is to be able to look at your staff and the study protocol while you're doing the feasibility to make sure that they're going to have adequate time and be able to support the study depending on how many procedures it has. For example, if you only have 5 procedures for one study, but you have 20 procedures for the other one, which one's going to take longer and how that ties into recruitment, because you might only be able to enroll 10 patients in the study that has 20 procedures where you could enroll 20 patients if they only have 5. So that's another thing to also consider. And you don't want to put a burden on your staff by over promising those numbers.
Yeah, and it goes back to your first point. I think it's important to be very honest with yourself during the feasibility process. I know from a site level, it's very tempting to inflate your numbers, or we sort of live in this world where any study that comes through, we need to get it in the door, we need to get some startup funds, whatever the case may be. But ultimately, if you overpromise and underdeliver, you're going to hurt your chances of getting the next study with that sponsor, perhaps, or you're going to end up spinning your wheels and have a sponsor who's knocking on your door all the time and saying, where are the patients? So I think it's really important, especially as you progress as a site, to be picky. And again, not just for the sponsor's sake, but for your sake as a site. There's no reason to unnecessarily burden yourself just because you're desperate to get a study in the door that you're never going to enroll in the first place. So being very honest throughout the feasibility process is, again, a great tip.
Yeah, that's a great point because, the other side that sometimes we don't think of or we don't see is that if, let's say, for example, you have a study and there's a site that isn't enrolling or is enrolling very low, that's extending the timeline of the study. And that goes into a lot of things like how much the study costs per day and things like that. So you have to be kind of considerate on the other side as well. And think of how recruitment is affecting the study as a whole. Whether you're doing really great and getting it going and the medicine's going to get approved possibly quicker, or you're not enrolling so well and maybe the timeline's not going as it should. But sometimes, some of those hard enrolling studies are just hard to enroll across the board. So it's just also important to look at those newsletters like we had discussed to make sure that it's a common trend. And if not, like you said, you can definitely reach out to your CRA and figure out other ways to pick up the numbers. Or possibly, another thing that ties into recruitment is diversity. So maybe getting somebody on the team that speaks a different language wherever you are, if that's something common, or just somebody that's within their same race or ethnicity to show that you definitely support the patients as a whole.
Yep. No, I could not agree more. Those are great tips. You got anything else, Christina?
No, that's it, Brad. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. All right. Ashley Hurd, thanks so much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me, Brad. It was nice to talk to you today.
Absolutely. So the topic du jour is subject recruitment, and we've been talking a little bit about how to, obviously, some tips and tricks, and then how to help increase diversity in our subject recruitment. So tell us a bit about your thoughts on that?
Well, when we spoke through LinkedIn, I did bring up the fact of like HBCUs, which is the integral part of subject recruitment and patient recruitment, especially at universities that have a healthcare background. So examples such as Morehouse, the School of Medicine, Florida A&M, they had a pharmacy school. Xavier has a pharmacy school. Howard has medical and pharmacy. There's several other, institutions that have these health-related fields focusing in a predominantly African American or person of color institutions. And that's how I think you could focus on subject recruitment, is through HBCUs.
Yeah, so essentially sort of helping create relationships within HBCUs to sort of help increase diversity across your patient recruitment. So we talked a little bit offline about how techniques you might use to help make that more effective. And essentially, one that came up immediately was, more education and transparency around the clinical trial process. I think we're all very aware of the history of African-American involvement. I say involvement, was not necessarily their will to participate, but we know, the history. So being able to really educate and, again, be transparent about what clinical trials are and maybe how far we've come to some degree as far as subject protection is concerned.
Yes. So basically, the only way you can really get people of color to join these clinical trials is, I think there's several ways. One is being more upfront with the patients and being transparent, like you just said. Another is hiring people of color to help with recruitment or to help be part of the clinical research team. Besides not just recruitment or hiring people of color, but getting that information out there is also maybe creating programs at these schools that focus on clinical research. I think that is a good way to start to initiate these types of changes. The transparency is very important. Another thing is promoting causes that affect the African American community, mostly like diseases that affect specifically African Americans. Example, sickle cell disease. That's a predominantly African American disease, but it's not really promoted. There's not a lot of information out there. Other diseases that might be predominant to African Americans, like lupus and, cancers that are higher in African Americans, such as colon cancer, things of that nature, can be important in the cause and getting involved in these organizations that focus on these disease states.
Sure. And so to me, I've talked about this before. It's, I guess it's sort of two-pronged, right? Obviously, if you're recruiting subjects for a trial, you've got sort of a short-term goal, which is get patients into a trial. But I think what you're speaking to is a little bit of a longer-term investment in those communities, right? It's not just, You're not just reaching out to get patients, you're creating a relationship. You are engaging more deeply within these diverse communities. And ultimately, it's just a good thing to do, period, right? It's just, it's the right thing to do. But secondly, you do open doors to being able to further educate and even, get people on board with participating in trials, which ultimately helps everyone.
Yeah. I think we're seeing like right now in this climate with the COVID and with everything that's kind of going around these days, I know as I was talking to some of my friends from college who I went with, professional women too. And, I told them like, are you going to get the vaccine? And they're saying, no, I'm going to wait until, I see how it affects other people. I don't know the information out there. They're skeptical about that. And they have the right to be, just because based on history, but at the same time, to break down those barriers is by talking about it and, joining the conversation, putting them in the conversation. Luckily, hopefully, I did some good with my friends and talked them into getting the vaccine. But, at the end of the day, it is their choice. But I do see that what's breaking the barrier down is lack of information. There's lack of subject recruitment for African Americans. And I feel that they have a valid point. And as an African American, I would know too, you're not seen as human sometimes, or you're brushed under the rug. So the main point to get that transparency is by actually having more people of color and people talking to other people of color about their issues and not just brushing them under the rug.
Yeah, I think that's a fair and maybe sort of nuanced point in what you said. Is I think you do have to start from a place of empathy because, like you said, I think it's perfectly reasonable, given what's happened in the past, for people to be skeptical and to be unsure and to not necessarily just immediately trust everything that they're told. I mean, and if you put yourself in their shoes, you can't blame them. That's perfectly understandable. So if you start there and use that as an opportunity to educate and, again, build trust and provide information so that they can make a more informed decision, I think, like you said, a lot of it goes back to just not having all of the information in front of them so that they can choose better for themselves. Or, better might be a subjective word. It may not be better. They could still choose not to participate or not get a vaccine or whatever the case may be. But at least you can help fill those gaps, knowledge gaps that may exist.
Yeah. I mean, another thing I feel like that could be a solution to is at HBCUs, there's a very big involvement with Greek life. A lot of Greek and sororities and fraternities, they are involved in community service and outreach. And forging that relationship between the fraternities and sororities can help bridge the gap between clinical research and subject recruitment. I guess examples like passing out flyers on these colleges' campuses. Maybe a student says, oh, my mom could be, part of this trial. She has diabetes or she has this disease. And maybe it can bring, do a chain reaction. So those are things that I think could be a positive and just engaging with the African American community along with other people of color. As I said, like Greek life is very important to us, and it's also a way to reach out with the community. But also at the same time, I think as African Americans, we're becoming more health conscious over time. I think we're not millennials and younger generations are seeing, what the effects can have on their future selves. And, we promote exercise, we promote diet and all those types of things. But I think that it's not perceived as that in culture and media just because people see us as, okay, well, she must just like fried chicken all the time. I like fried chicken, but I like, baked chicken and things like that too. But I think what we need to do is change that perception of the cultural lifestyle of African Americans too. Because I mean, a lot of us in our families and in our extended families, we are health conscious. We do want to make good choices for our aunts and our uncles and our grandparents and our sisters and our mother and fathers. They're just as important just as anybody else's kin. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's, again, it's all part of a sort of a bigger picture in actually engaging with communities. And I think something that we kind of glossed over, but you did mention is there's there's a lot of benefit in if you diversify your staff. Mm-hmm. And, again, I think like you said, just naturally people are going to listen to people that they can relate to, mm-hmm. right? So if you diversify your staff, I think with that, it may be a little bit easier to make inroads with different communities that are more diverse and different than what you are. Because again, ultimately, that's what it's about. It's about helping everyone and sort of bringing everybody into the bigger picture of not just clinical research, but health in general, right?
Yeah. I think it's always about, we talk about diversity, but we're not putting that plan into action sometimes. And we have to put that plan into action.
Yeah, that's a very well put. And I think that goes for a lot of clinical research in general. We talk about a lot of things, and there tends to be a lot of talk at a high level from sponsors and CROs, but ultimately the sites are the ones interacting with the patients, right? And so it's really the responsibility, let's say, is on us. It's on us to be out there creating the relationships, making inroads, educating, being a resource for people, not just for clinical research, but again, for their health in general.
Yeah, it does start at the patient site level. I do feel like if you don't have that empathy, because of course, like a lot of African Americans, first is a socioeconomic issue. How I'm going to get to these clinical sites, how I'm going to get the medication. That's one. Two, a thing about also is the patient interaction with the doctor at these appointments and getting actual genuine information. Example of this is like, I was working on a clinical project at my previous employer, and I had this sweet African American man. He was in this long study for, I think it was prostate cancer. It was a long, long study. And you had to do several, I think monthly, or he would come in like every 3 months for follow-up. And we had him to do a questionnaire. And of course, his questionnaire did not line up to his actual true feelings. So I don't think he felt comfortable in sharing those feelings. And it was not until, I talked with one of my study team coordinators, and I was just like, I was concerned because we're not getting actual true data, because he was one way, I think it was I can't remember this. It was like a happiness scale or overall quality of life scale type of questionnaire. And he was, that day when he filled it out, he was like at, I think 99 or something in the high 90s. And then when we got his test results back, he sent an email, because that's how he communicated with him, is through email. And he was just like, apprehensive and worried, and I don't have anybody to talk to at home. And so his questionnaire did not align up with his true feelings. And so I was just like, this doesn't make any sense. I told him, like, please be honest with us. Please be, transparent. I think it's one thing, being an African American, it's hard to be transparent or to have that conversation with your doctor.
Right.
And especially if this trial's been going on for a long time. The doctor that I worked along with, he's seeing patients too, while also trying to see clinical research patients, and, giving him maybe like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and he's not being open, or he's not being honest, or he's not being truthful in what he's trying to say. And so he just shuts down, because I guess that empathy is not there. Plus it's just like, it's not a person of color that's treating him. It's someone that's not a person of color. So he may feel a different way,
right? Sure. Yeah. I think that's endemic across trials, regardless of that. Even, I mean, I think you, as a site and as a coordinator, you're the first point of contact oftentimes with these patients, whether or not they have a relationship with the doctor, that may affect things. But, we have to put our money where our mouth is. I mean, we can't always be so clinical. We do have to build trust and have empathy and allow them to feel comfortable, so that, you do get good data. You don't get somebody who's just telling you what you want to hear because they're part of a study. Yeah. So I think that's a great point, and it's a good anecdote that does point out, if you don't have that level, you don't put in the work to build those relationships, then ultimately, what are we doing? You're going to get data that's wrong. You're going to get drugs to market that shouldn't be there, or vice versa. So it really speaks to a bigger issue, and the idea shouldn't be just pumping patients through studies. I mean, it's bigger than that.
Yeah, and I think it's also because when you have that, just when you do subject recruitment, I feel like maybe just from being in it for a couple of months, I haven't started a whole career in it yet. But just from my point of view, I felt like some of these PIs had so much on their plate with not just with patients, but also with studies. Like this one doctor that I worked with, he had at least about 10 different clinical trials going on. And it just kind of makes me wonder, how well do they know what's going on?
Sure.
Or things of that nature. And that could affect subject recruitment because, a patient comes in, they want to talk about something and he doesn't really he's not up to speed, or he's focusing on other important tasks too. So I think that's another thing to look at is like, are we stretching PIs too thin a little bit too, just because of the sheer amount of work? They're not only just doing investigational work, but they're treating patients and they're either doing surgeries and doing rotations for med school. And, the list goes on and on. So
yeah, no, there's no question. And I mean, that's almost, we could do a whole other episode about that, because again, I think there's a ideal way that trials should work. And then there's the way that it happens in the real world. And oftentimes, unfortunately, that is the case, that the PI is sort of the least tuned in at times. They obviously have to maintain a certain level of oversight, but a lot of times they don't understand even what the coordinator is doing. And that's why, again, I think it's so important that the team around the PI is really tight and they have really good soft skills and they can really, again, build long-term and lasting relationships with patients, because frankly, oftentimes that's the difference between somebody staying in your study and getting out. Is, do they feel comfortable? Do they like you? I mean, do they want to come see you once a month or sometimes once a week, depending on what the protocol dictates? I mean, that's a very underappreciated aspect, I think, of what the clinical research coordinator's role oftentimes is.
Yeah, it is.
So, yeah. No, I love that. I think that's, again, just brushing the surface of, those issues. So anything else before we wrap up?
No, I guess just my 3 main points is that if you really want to get diverse patient recruitment is 1, hire people of color, like you said, at the site level, people that want to help their community. Hire people, or also being, spreading that information to the African American community or to other, people of color communities. So transparency and information is very important out there. So those are like the main gist of subject recruitment for people of color.
All right, Ashley, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much, Brad. I hope you have a good day, good week.
You too. Thanks. All right, Dr. Christopher Gantz, thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, no, thank you again for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this conversation.
Absolutely. It's, again, my hope that we can share as many good sort of best practices between sites as possible. And I know that you've got quite a bit of experience in setting up successful recruitment campaigns or services, if you will. So tell us a little bit about what you've done and kind of where you are now.
Yeah, well, a few years ago, I was working at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and working on a variety of different studies. I realized that there was a real opportunity in centralizing the recruitment services sort of across the institution so that we could really focus on removing the barriers to clinical trial participation. And so you really focus on that and take some of that weight off of the study teams. So through a few different conversations and presentations to leadership, we were approved to build out that service. And the service works very closely with study teams. We identify the patient population that they're interested in. We help sort of craft the messaging that's going to be used and the other marketing materials that might go around with the study. And then we leverage what we refer to as an honest broker mechanism. And that allows us to approach potential participants on behalf of the study team or to do outreach to them. And if the individual's interested in participating, they would contact the study team directly. If they're not interested in participating, the study team never knows that they were contacted. And then if they want to opt out from future communications, they would opt out through us. So we were able to launch that. It was very successful. Then my colleagues at Stanford University were similar in interested in building out something similar. So I had the opportunity to work with them and sort of craft a very similar type of service out there that they now have up and running. And again, similar response where, it's just sort of the economy of scale of being able to centralize things has really created a real shift in their ability to recruit participants. The return on investment for what sort of the centralized model is able to do is really big. And then so after that, I moved over to Thomas Jefferson University in the Sidney Kimmel Cancer Center, where my office is the research liaison office. And again, we're building out that same centralized recruitment model, again, using the honest broker mechanism. And we've recently also now expanded that model so that it now covers all of the institutions. So my office, again, is nested within the Cancer Center, but there's also the Research Institute, the broader Research Institute that covers all non-cancer trials. And now this service, there's parity between those two sides. So any study at Jefferson that's recruiting participants could potentially benefit from using the service. We've also additionally been able now just recently to add clinical trial screeners to the office. And they're sort of a bookend where on one end we have the direct outreach potential participants. On that other end, the screeners can do sort of the pre-screening for potential participants and then filter them through for study teams and pass them on. And they can also do sort of inbound calling and outbound calling, so sort of a call center, so that they can again remove some of those barriers from study teams. Study teams are often very busy with sort of a dozen different things they might be doing. So anything that we can do to reduce those barriers, kind of streamline processes, really pays some dividends.
Yeah, so I love this idea of a centralized model. I talk to and work with a lot of smaller sites and site networks. So even if you're not operating under the auspices of a larger institution, this is something anyone, I think, can implement. We know how the lives of study coordinators can be hectic. And in a lot of instances, the coordinator is sort of the front line in recruitment and, even sometimes the only real person who's handling recruitment for a particular study. So as much as you can streamline and centralize, I think that's the huge sort of message here. So I'm kind of interested to know a little about the mechanics of the honest broker system. So obviously that broadens the reach and sort of is able to incorporate more people into the process. But what does that look like from a practical standpoint? Are there materials that you distribute to these people, or are there certain agreements you have to have in place, or how does that work?
Yeah. So we work closely with the institution's privacy office and the IRB. And in fact, the honest broker acts as a proxy for the privacy office. So we usually do an intake with study teams. We provide them with boilerplate language that they need to insert into their protocol, indicating to the IRB that they're working with this type of service. We do an intake with the study team where we would get sort of the inclusion-exclusion criteria for the study. And then we would search the electronic health record on their behalf. That would generate a list of anybody who's potentially eligible. We then work with the study team to craft the messaging that would go out to those potential participants. And we really work really hard to kind of shift the messaging from sort of the traditional recruitment letter that many people might have seen, where the study team is trying to sort of upsell the study and create enthusiasm around participation. They often say things like, we're inviting you to participate in this exciting opportunity. And that's not always the case that participation is really that exciting. So we try to reframe it, sort of make it more of a genuine ask, sort of present the study in sort of different terms. So it might say something, we would introduce the investigator. In my case, I'm Dr. Gantz. My team and I are working on an asthma study. And we think that this research is very important, but we realize that it won't be successful without the help of individuals like you. If you can help us, this is what we would ask you to do. Then we very clearly bullet point out what we're asking. And then we put one point of contact at the end. Sometimes if there's multiple points of contact, people won't contact anybody. It's too many choices. So we put one point of contact. Sometimes that's a dedicated study email and a study phone number in case there's a change in staff that you don't need to update your materials. And then the PI signs that either paper letter or email communication. We send it out. If the person gets the communication and they're interested in learning more, so that letter, it's an invitation to a conversation, is how we describe it. they contact the study team, and then the study team can take it from there, sort of do that next level evaluation of whether the person's eligible and sort of, get them into the study. If the person's not interested, the study team never knows that they were contacted. So they're not aware of who is on that list in any way. Then also, if that person gets the communication and they decide, I don't want to receive these communications, we provide them with information about opting out, and we manage that opt-out so that they won't receive future communications. So it's really straightforward once you get it up and running. And again, the return on investment that we're able to do just by consolidating that, where we can reach out to sort of many, many people that the study team might not otherwise have access to, really is quite large.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of important but sort of subtle points within there. So the first is that carefully crafting your material. I mean, just something you pointed out there, having some sort of meeting, whatever the case may be, intake, I believe you co-referred to it, but really sitting down, crafting out the important points is very important. I think a lot of times it's sort of second nature for a research site to just roll with whatever the sponsor has provided, which, let's be frank, that's not always the best material and not always necessarily the best way to interact with the patient. And I think dovetailing on that, we ask a lot from these patients. So just even having that in your mind when you speak with them and when you do reach out to them, and understanding that in some ways it's additional burden for them to participate in the trial. It's not like you said, it's not necessarily it's this great opportunity. Well, it very well may be, but it's definitely going to be extra visits, extra time, maybe time off work, maybe traveling across town to come see you. So that alone, just keeping that in your mind, I think can help you better relate and engage with patients as you try to tell them about the clinical trial that you're potentially trying to recruit them for.
Yeah, and you make a really great point. And one piece of advice I would give to anybody who's developing their recruitment materials is to take that outside perspective. Even maybe running it by someone, a loved one or a friend who's not working in the field, and kind of think through what the ask is and what that means for someone who's not, sort of embedded in clinical trials, can really help you frame the messaging. One thing that we find a lot is that, just from a marketing perspective, one thing we tell study teams often is don't bury the lead. Sometimes, you'll see a letter and it'll be, 2 pages full of text. And it's just a lot of information, so we tell people, try to make it concise and put what you're asking people to do sort of right at the top. People tend to read what's at the beginning, sometimes, and they'll sometimes read what's at the end. But, you want to be very clear and concise with what you're asking people to do. Sometimes we've had people who we were trying to recruit healthy controls, and the individuals gave us feedback that they got a communication and they didn't realize it was appropriate for them. So maybe they got a study letter about asthma, and they open it and they say, oh, well, I don't have asthma. But 2 paragraphs down, that's where the study team had indicated that they're looking for people without asthma to sort of be healthy controls to balance the study. So it's really important to make sure that you're putting that information front and center, and that you're thinking through it as someone who's not familiar with the study.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Something I've actually not thought of before. It's just talking to somebody who's doesn't live in the world we live in. I think we take a lot for granted when you've been looking at protocols and consent forms for 10 years. You start to sort of dream in acronyms that come along with clinical research. So I think that's a great idea, to talk to somebody who has no idea what you're talking about. Does it make sense to them? Can they understand what you're talking about? I love that idea. And I know we talked a little bit offline about interviewing or getting feedback from patients and subjects after their participation in a study. I think that's a good opportunity that will help you moving forward to say, what was your experience like? What spoke to you? Why did you decide to participate? And sort of start to incorporate those things into your material going forward as well.
Yeah, I think if you have the opportunity to kind of incorporate that patient voice and kind of have those conversations, it really is incredibly valuable.
And even like you had said prior to recording, again, it's a short game and a long game. We are trying to recruit subjects into trials, but we're also trying to educate the larger community as to the importance of clinical research. And I think oftentimes the people who have participated and had a good experience can become the loudest voices to help sort of tell everyone else about the importance and how good of an experience it can be.
You're absolutely right. I think so. Someone who is a past participant, hearing their story is going to be way more compelling than anything that I could sort of come up with a recruitment letter or any other sort of outreach that we do. It really is amazing. And I think you mentioned when we were speaking offline that you've had patient referrals come in, and we often have that. So we often have other participants referring people to the study just based on the positive experience that they've had. So yeah, it really is very valuable. And then just sort of speaking to that sort of long game, that idea of that, there is that specific, study recruitment. There's this, today we need to recruit these people for this study. That broader education, I think, is something that I'm seeing more and more of, which is really great that there's, more groups that are out there working to educate the public on the value of participating in clinical trials, because I really do think that generally the public doesn't realize how important they are to clinical trials. That at the end of the day, without their participation, trials wouldn't move forward. So there's a number of things that we try to do to sort of shape that conversation and engage people. I think I mentioned that one of the things I'm really proud of right now that we're doing is we're working with local high schools, and we're trying to develop a pipelining program that sort of fulfills multiple needs. We want to expose teens to clinical trials as a career. I personally didn't know about clinical trials as a career option. It wasn't something that I was aware that you could do until I was in undergrad. And then so the graduate students were looking for undergrads to participate in their studies. And I kind of got an introduction to it in that way. But we didn't really have, and some of my other colleagues have said the same, that we didn't really have people coming into high school and kind of talking about it and introducing the idea. So that's what we're trying to do. So we're engaging high school students, creating opportunities for them to work with us and possibly find out if that's a career they want to pursue. But we're also engaging them around the idea of oncology screening and the importance of that, so that they'll grow up to be adults who understand the importance of oncology screening, and they'll go out into their community and share that messaging as well. And then we also want them to be informed consumers about clinical trials. We want them to know, as themselves, how important clinical trials are and have an understanding of why they might be asked to participate in a trial. We want them to share that information also with their community. So if people hear things about clinical trials that may not be accurate, they can act as a source of truth and sort of, convey that message into their community. And I really think that, engaging with high school students and younger, if the opportunity, I know that some groups are doing programs with middle schoolers as well, that there's an opportunity to create a paradigm shift in the way that we look at clinical trials in this country. And I think I mentioned, the analogy that I often give is it's sort of like blood drives, right? So if I were to ask you to donate blood, you might say yes, you might say no, but you wouldn't say why. You would understand why I was asking you to donate blood. You have an understanding that donating blood is used to help save lives. But it's not really the case with clinical trials that people fundamentally know when they get asked. So you kind of have to have those two conversations. You have to explain why you might be asking them, and then explain them about the specific trial. I'm hoping that we get to the point where people fundamentally understand what clinical trials are, why they're being asked to participate, and then as informed consumers, they can make decisions about whether they want to participate in that particular study.
Yeah, and that's something I think I'm guilty of not doing, is engaging more with the community. And it's just a good thing to do, period. And then B, the sort of nice side effect is that people may be more able or more interested in participating in your trial, right? So, but it all goes back to investing that time and energy into the community. I spend a lot of time, talking to other clinical research professionals, but I should be working just as hard within the communities that we serve as clinical researchers. So I think that's at least for me, it's been a little bit of an undervalued thing, and it's something I need to focus more on. So I appreciate you guys are doing so much in your community. I think that's awesome.
Yeah. And, I think maybe there's an opportunity, with the conversation that you're starting and some of the conversations that others in the field are starting, for us to connect a little bit. I'm working in my niche, and there are people working sort of elsewhere doing maybe similar work. And the more that we have the chance to connect and share what's working, what's not working, I think, we can establish maybe a network and sort of, create sort of a real energy behind this sort of approach.
Well, yeah. And ultimately that is what it's all about. We want to help people get better. We want them to be healthier. We want drugs to get to market faster and less expensively. And this is the way to do it. If everyone can come together and figure out the best way to make that happen, then everybody wins.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
All right, Dr. Gantz, anything else before we go?
No, again, happy to be a part of this conversation and really looking forward to hearing from the other people you're going to have on the podcast.
I'm excited myself. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Note to File podcast. All show notes, episode transcripts, and contact information can be found at notetofilepodcast.com. And again, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thanks again for listening.